Today we're taking a look at the Neso P1 case and the Chione M3 240mm all-in-one cooler, courtesy of Gamdias. Gamdias had reached out to me to take a look at this case and cooler combination. They both looked pretty compelling, so I wanted to build a Ryzen 7700X system with my RTX 3060 Ti and test them out. The Neso P1 looks like an interesting case, to me at least, because it's huge and it's a dual chamber case. In terms of the airflow, pretty much every panel has mesh on it, so there's a lot of breathability here. It's a pretty interesting shape too, it's trapezoidal, and I do think that from what I saw on the website at least, it looks pretty good in all of the color variants. The one that I have here is obviously the white color, and I have the white color on the all-in-one cooler as well. And just looking at this case, it looks like it's pretty well set up for either air cooling or water cooling. You can either use an AIO or build a fully custom loop in here. There's tons of radiator and fan mounting locations, which I really like. As far as the top mount goes, you can mount rads up to 360mm. The side rad can either hold a 360mm or a 420mm rad. The bottom doesn't actually technically support any radiators. You might be able to fit one down there if you're crafty or if it's thin enough, or if you purchase thin fans, but you can still install 3 120mm fans for extra airflow at the bottom. It's kind of wild how many fan positions there are in this case. The Neso P1 has a fully tempered glass side panel with a nifty locking button. It's on a permanent mount hinge, but the hinge moves nicely, and I found it to be kind of useful when working in the build. Interestingly enough, the front panel of this case is also tempered glass, and it's also on a swinging hinge system, so you can really open this case up to work on it. It's actually one of the easiest cases that I think I've ever worked in because it's almost an open test bench at that point. All you have is the rear side where the motherboard would mount and the back side. Like I mentioned, this is obviously the white version of the case, but it comes in white, black, and red, as well as a black and red option. The case does come with a couple of interesting accessories. You can see that the case is trapezoidal shaped, and you can actually reconfigure this case to be mounted or laid down on its side, which is pretty neat. You don't see a lot of cases that can really do that anymore. The only ones I can really think of off the top of my head are some of the older Be Quiet cases. In general, this case just offers a lot of customization, and you can change quite a bit about it, which I kind of like. I don't necessarily tweak my PCs after I physically set them up, but when I do go to refresh hardware or clean them out after a couple of years, sometimes it might be kind of nice to reconfigure the way that the case is actually set up or built. So this is kind of cool. Continuing on with the interesting stuff, you can actually rotate the PCI Express slot frame, for example, depending on how you want to mount your GPU. I thought that was pretty interesting too. This case kind of reminds me of the old cube cases or dual chamber ones, which I was a pretty big fan of. The Neso P1 does have a 2-chamber system with the PSU and the storage, mounting basically right behind the motherboard tray. Since the case is so large, you get a pretty generous 90mm worth of clearance in the backside of the case, which makes building and managing all those cables super easy. It's even nicer because Gamdias includes a bunch of Velcro straps. Deep down, I'll always have love for dual chamber cases in this style. You can really see it and showcase the build, which I like. That's something some of the older cube style cases I think were missing or didn't quite hit the mark on. As for the front panel I/O, you're getting 2 USB 3.0 ports, a USB-C Gen 2 port, and an integrated audio jack for 3.5mm, and of course, the power button. I like the button selection, but I don't think anyone's really using a 3.5mm jack now, especially on gaming PCs, and especially on high-end gaming PCs. I also would really like it if they could move a USB-C port, or even a USB 3.0 standard port, up towards the top of the case, while the case is in the standard vertical position. This might be a little bit of a nitpick in my opinion, but I do like extra ports up at the top. Because this case is reconfigurable, that's not a super issue, and you can pretty much get a USB hub or extension cable from, well, pretty much anyone these days. So it's not a big deal, but it is something that I think I'd like with this case. As for the cooling, like I said, it's pretty much over the top. Every panel except the front and side, which are tempered glass, is pretty much breathable mesh, including the entire backside of the back panel, as well as the bottom and the top. and most of the backside of the case also is pretty breathable as well. I liked that they designed the top rad mount with extra rad mounting space. You have this rad mount bracket. This will basically help with getting the rad and the fans to fit up there and not interfering with motherboard heatsinks. You know, the large VRM heatsinks and even sometimes the EPS or CPU power cable can interfere with fans that are top mount, especially radiators. In terms of my testing, I wanted to test with pretty much the worst case scenario by installing the cooler and the fans totally underneath this bracket. Everything actually fit and it performed pretty well. Keeping with the oversized train of thought, you can pretty much fit a lot of the larger EATX type motherboards that you might purchase for workstations, as well as GPUs up to 426 millimeters in this case. That's huge. The case is coming in at about 490 millimeters long, 310 millimeters wide, and 495 millimeters tall, with a weight around 26 pounds. This is a beefy, massive type of case for high-end builds with some flair in my opinion. This is pretty much the polar opposite of those micro ITX builds, but I love builds that are huge like this. Working inside of the case was plenty easy, multiple cable management pass-throughs, everything pretty much had a grommet, and I didn't really have any issues with feeding the cables through, and I think everything pretty much made sense. It's actually kind of funny, my standard ATX motherboard and standard RTX 3060 Ti pretty much look like tiny PC parts in here because they're really sized for a mid-size case. I really wanted to see what my AMD Ryzen 7700X and RTX 3060 Ti could do in this case with the Chione M3 cooler. Now this case does not come with fans included, so you would have to supply your own fans. Generally, in terms of case testing, I don't install extra fans, so all of my testing will be with no extra case fans and just the Chione M3 cooler. In terms of the ambient temperature during testing, it was basically around 72 to 73 Fahrenheit each time. Each of the tests were run 3 times to get an average temperature and clock speed. I ran the tests with the fan speed at 50% and then again at 100%. I think when I'm testing coolers and cases at the same time, my go-to benchmark is always going to be RealBench. This benchmark stresses the GPU and the CPU simultaneously, which puts a lot of stress on the overall cooling system, and it's going to give you a pretty good idea of how good your case cooling truly is. The Ryzen 7700X cores averaged about 95C with an average clock rate 4.95 GHz at 50%. But when I increased the fan speed to 100%, they averaged 5.1 GHz at 95C. This CPU is one of the early X series, so it's actually targeting 95C. So the temperatures are in line and expected, they're fine. As far as the clock rate though, there was a little bit of improvement there from just increasing the fan speed, which is what I want to see. That means that the extra fan speed and the cooler and the case are functioning relatively well. The GPU core temp averaged 62.4C with an average clock rate of 1950 MHz. Like I said, this case doesn't come with extra fans, so I wanted to see what would happen when I increased the fan speed on the radiator to see if it would help the GPU at all. Pretty much the GPU temp stayed right around 61, 62 degrees. The core clocks did somehow go up just a touch. They averaged around 1965 MHz, but that's almost within error, so I would say it's roughly equal. As for the Prime 95 stress test, the CPU hit 95C in all scenarios, which again is expected on an X series CPU, but the clock rate at 50% fan speed averaged 4.8 GHz. Whereas the 100% fan speed averaged about 4.85 GHz. It's not a huge jump in terms of raw numbers, only 50 MHz there, but considering the amount of heat and power load that Prime 95 produces, increasing the clock speed at all pretty much means the 100% fan speed is allowing extra thermal headroom. Even though the 100% fan speed performed better, there was a cost in terms of noise. At 50% fan speed, at about 2.5 feet away from my case, my phone measured 32.8 dBA worth of noise. That's very quiet, definitely something I could tolerate, and in fact, most of my rigs are a little bit louder than that. Looking at 100% fan speed though, I measured 41.4 dBA worth of noise. I didn't actually go through and retest everything at the 65% fan speed level in terms of performance, but I did set that, and I do like that as kind of a middle ground. I was looking at about 34, 35 dBA, and I think that's worth it. The Neso P1 comes in at around $190 as of the making of this video. And the Chione M3 240mm water cooler is just under about 100 bucks. I really liked this case design, and I think it has some serious potential for some very nice gaming builds. I also think the Chione M3 cooler did a fine job, especially on a power-hungry and hot CPU like the Ryzen 7700X. I think as far as the Ryzen 7700X would go, I probably wouldn't go smaller than the 240mm version of the Chione M3. I might even say you might want the 360mm rad from Gamdias if you want to eke out that extra 100 or 200 megahertz depending on your scenarios. If you have the budget though, I think these are some quality parts from Gamdias, and I would definitely consider recommending them for anyone who's building or upgrading a build. Make sure to get subscribed to the channel for more gaming and home lab builds, and then ring that bell for notifications. If you like this one, hit that thumbs up button. If not, well, let me know why. Until next time, keep on clocking.